Okay, let's talk representation. What is this? Clearly, it's a map, right? It's a set of symbols and related sketching and visual information that is designed to represent the way something out there in the real world looks and works, right? We see a lot of features here. We see some scribbling some blue scribbles to represent water, both outside of and within this sort of delineated borders, which are also present. We see the borders; those probably represent something like a beach, although there is a little tan stretch down there representing some kind of maybe more accessible beach. We have a tent. We have a tree by a lake. We have a well. We have some grass. And why is there grass only in one spot and not the rest? The grass is there to signify something. So this is a representation. It's a model of the outside world. It's not correct. It's not perfectly accurate. It's not a one-to-one mapping, but it is a good mapping. It's a spatial mapping of where things are in relation to one another spatially. So, that being setting the stage, let's roll back a little bit. We've been talking a lot about associating ideas. We've seen how we can take basic stimuli and create sort of complex response patterns out of it. The whole idea of conditioning, right? Creating new associations that are helpful for predicting things that are going to happen in the environment and plan around it, right? And we discussed in the last lecture a bit about how you can use that to maybe plan your day, right? So how might let's put that more clearly. So think about navigation. Goats have to travel a lot to get all the food they need for the day. They graze, they eat all kinds of strange plants, but they have to do a lot of movement during the day, just like we do at the end of our day, or we once did when we commuted. That you have to plan. Okay, I have to go here, 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 and here. Now, when it's time to go home, what do I do? Do I just retrace my steps all the way back? Or do I take a shortcut? Do I take the route that I know will take me directly home instead of having to trace back all the associated points on that path? Here's the thing, though. Of course, we choose the shortcut, but we can also do shortcuts in situations we've never been in before. How is it that we're able to say, "Oh, I'm in a brand new conference hall, and I have to go to the bathroom. Somebody tells me where that is, but then I can easily plan my route to the next place I need to go," right? And that's because we're using some kind of knowledge of the space to plan these novel routes, things we never even passed through. We don't have to directly experience an entire space to understand that there are routes within it that we may not have walked yet. So, simple links between stimuli are not going to help us understand the broader representation of the space that we inhabit. Cognitive maps are the name we use for this. So we can create structured representations of the environment that we live in. We store important information like the relative locations of different features, maybe the properties of those features, the maybe events that are likely to happen in this environment depending on time, and also just the sights and sounds and everything that we might experience too. And these maps are these internal models of the outside world that let us make predictions about what we're going to see. And the first time this was explored was, well, no, not the exactly first, but a prominent time this was explored was in Tolman, 1946. So Tolman trained rats to run a very simple maze with a very long path. It's this strange, quirky shape here, right? Rat comes in, sees a big circular room, and they see a little path that they can walk down. And they go down it a bit. They have to turn right. They have to turn left again. They turn left and down an even longer path. Ooh, there's food. There's food now. Okay. Then, after training the rat that, hey, this is something that you can learn to run pretty quickly, they then blocked that path and presented several new options. So the original path is cut off, and now there are a whole bunch of new radial options coming out from that same location. A rat that was only capable of learning direct associations wouldn't really show any difference here. They'd probably still try to walk down that main path. But where did the rat choose, do you think? Overwhelmingly, they preferred new paths that led directly to the food, or where the food once was. The rat runs in here, says, oh, this is mostly the same. Oh, there's new paths. And runs straight to where the food used to be. So the rats had picked up some relational information and relative locations. They kind of understood something about the way that the paths worked, the way that the turns kind of oriented them, and where that food was located. They didn't need the old path to be there to make sense of, oh wait, I know I'm in a broader context. There's a new path that leads more directly to my desired location, because that's where food typically exists. So there's something a lot more complex going on here than just door signals, turn signals, food. It's something where the rat is able to make sense of the spatial layout of their environment. Now, a brief aside, some rats, rats are an example of a species that would really need this kind of ability. I'm sure some of you are thinking, I'm not sure I would make the right choice. I get turned around in rooms, and we all do. But rats have a particular need to navigate tight little closed quarters because that's where they live, right? So there are some differences, some individual differences, especially between species. But this is still something that we're all capable of doing to some extent, and we are able to hold these internal representations of our outside world. So that brings us to the general concept of representations. Minds can be described as representational entities. Kind of makes sense. It's that sort of abstract world above whatever the body is interacting with in the actual environment, if you remember some of our history of mind. Everything the mind does operates on some sort of copy of things from the real world called representations, and then they're held in some reduced form, neural firing, of course, but held there somehow and made operable by all the functions of the mind. So what might constitute a representation? Well, anything that you can put your mind to in a fairly literal sense. So here's some representations. We might have representations of just singular objects. So the apple, right? We have properties of objects. Well, I can conceive that apples are large, knowing that is a different thing than a small apple, right? Concepts is more abstract. The idea that the apple exists. What is existence? What is it to be extant, right? Desires. I would like to eat that apple. That is some kind of internal representation of my own state, likely formed in my mind from signals from my stomach that, hey, you're hungry, but it is an abstract idea. It's a concept that we can maintain in our minds. Our emotions come into play a lot. There's a lot more to emotional states than just their abstract representation, but we understand emotions in this representative way. I can know that I am sad that the apple is out of reach. Nations are a concept. They are an idea that you typically agree on. Hey, we're all in this nation, but that this apple breed originated in Japan. colors, which are tricky because it's hard to describe a color, but yet we can still store knowledge about it. I can tell that this apple, I'm describing a Fuji apple, is both red and green. Molecules, the concept of a molecule, that is a toy model that we keep in our minds that we learned in some old chemistry or physics class about. Oh, well, I know that this apple is probably made of carbon. A lot of carbohydrates in this apple. These are all representations because they're all named types of things that we can keep track of in our minds. All of these are representations. So, let's think back a bit, remembering, was there a tree on the map we saw earlier? Yeah, it was right there by the lake, right? But when I prompted you with that, you started to think back. Was there a tree? Oh, where was it located? Was it connected to something? You consulted some sort of internal representation to try to prompt you with, wait, was there a tree there or not? Okay, how about if I leave the tree to travel to the rocks, do I pass by the red tent or not? No. It's the red tent to the south. And I don't need to go there to pass by for the rocks. But you can see how that is me consulting my mental map, my cognitive map, to make a prediction about, okay, if I'm going to plan my day, I need to drop some things off of the tent, but I need to get to the rocks. Ooh, should I reroute myself, right? Okay, how about if I travel from the rocks to the beach, do I pass by any flowers? Again, we can see in this case, yes, we actually do. The rocks are in the north, the beach is on the southeast, and I do pass by flowers. I can pick some for my tent display or whatever I'm doing. So, representing the island. What mental representations are we actually using to answer these spatial questions when the map is not physically presented to us, to our eyes, when the stimulus is not present? So what parts of the world do we actually need to store? I'm going to guess that you got some of those questions right and some of them wrong. It's not a very important map to you, so you wouldn't have encoded it deeply. But how did you get them right, and how did you get them wrong? What was missing? What's going on when you are consulting this internal representation? Do we really store all of it? Could I really reproduce every inch of detail? Well, some people have that ability more than others. That's a sort of an individual difference, but there's also, you might be able to do that more if you spent every day of your life with this map. You'd have all of the small spatial representations stored. Versus maybe a more coarse version of like, there is a tree, it's like next to a lake, and it's north of the tent, right? So just storing these small scale relationships between objects in the environment. This gets at the idea that there's more than one way to represent the island, and each of our representations will differ, especially depending on, how long we spent with it. Most of yours will probably be similar. Mine's a little bit better because I've been working directly with it in this presentation. But, so, yeah. More questions about this. Consider, what mental representations do you need to have to be able to text your friend? It's definitely a few. First of all, there's all the language you're going to use, of course. You have to have that somehow. You have to have the idea of what you want to say. You have to have the concept of who your friend is and perhaps even why they might care. Right? There's more complex ones, like what mental representations do you need to ride a bike? That's a little trickier. Riding a bike has more to do with your physical body and your balance. A lot of control going on there. A lot of automated control by the synergies of your physical system. But you still need some, right? You need to kind of remember what position your body ought to be in to ride the bike. You can't just stand on it. You have to, mount the bike. Yeah. So What are representations? We're talking about how they're used, sort of. What are they? So the simplest way to put it is that they are the symbols in the mind that stand for something in the world. So there are other definitions we'll come to later as well, but Pierce, 1902, gives three interacting components that are at play when you're dealing with representations. There's the object that is actually being represented, the symbol, so the representation itself, what is the symbol I'm using, and then some interpretant that helps me access more of the information around that symbol. What's the meaning and the content of the symbol? Hopefully also related directly to the object in the world. So here we have a tree is an object. Tree, the word, is the symbol, the sign, and the interpretant would be able to access information about, oh, it is tall, it is a plant, it is woody, right? So representations, they are containers for meaningful information in the outside world. They can be literal actual symbols, so words or signs or literal written symbols like the do not enter symbol, right? Or every letter you ever saw. Or it can be a more like a meaningful relationship, a little bit more complex than that. The idea that fire leads to smoke, so that's something that we can observe in the world and maintain some sort of representation of, such that if we see smoke, we can reason backward and say, ooh, shoot, that must mean there's fire. Smoke doesn't really happen without fire. That's not something I have in my representations. It might be if you lived in a place where it was quite damp all the time, you might actually acquire a representation of, well, there can be smoke without actual roaring fires, but you'd have to pick that up. You'd have to incorporate that into your representation of how fire and smoke are related. So, okay, let's talk about abstraction. So, representations can be abstract, right? They don't have to be a good photographic memory of a tree, right? Anything that you can have that points to that tree, the concept of a tree, that can work. The key is consistency. So as long as the abstract symbol that you choose represents that same concept every time, or maybe not identical every time, but more or less points to the same kinds of stuff, it doesn't really matter what it looks like. So think about at the bottom here the number 9, right? The concept of 9. We use that all the time. It's a count, right? I can have 9 things in the world. But the number 9, the Roman digit 9 that we use, that's just a symbol. It's just a collection of curves. It has nothing to do with there being 9 objects sitting on a table. There are other ways to write 9. There's the old Roman numerals. There's all the different languages all have a concept of 9, but we all use a different abstract symbol to point to it. We all know what 9 means, but we have a different symbolic representation for it. And so that's the same can be true of the way you represent things in your mind. And this is great, because the idea is that this abstraction, this way of saying sort of like, hey, it doesn't matter what symbol I use, what unique arrangement of patterns I use, as long as those patterns point to some meaningful real-world phenomenon, then I can use it. And that opens up the door to use these kinds of abstract representations for all kinds of things in the world. Especially the concept of just language in general, right? It's all symbols, all pointing at different things that exist in the world. Let's look at an apple. So there are different ways to abstract away from the apple. Here is a photo of an apple. It's not an actual apple, but if you had this in your mind, it would be a pretty high fidelity representation of an apple. I can also just say the word apple, and you kind of get it. You kind of see, what that means. But does that bear any resemblance to the apple? Absolutely not. Oh my gosh. The word as it's written on the page here is just a bunch of scribbles. Has nothing to do with the shape of an apple, the way an apple tastes, any of that stuff. But also the spoken word. It's just a set of frequencies that vibrate together. Apple, apple. It has a shape in a way, an auditory shape, but it's not doing anything. It's not connecting at all. What about this symbol? Well, that's closer. That does actually take us a little bit closer to an apple, but it's still not very accurate. It's kind of oblong. It doesn't, it's possible to confuse that with something else, but because it's so close, it's fairly close to an apple. This is the kind of thing that we would keep track of, right? We would almost automatically say, oh, yeah, that's related to the thing up there, right? I saw this pictogram and it made me think of an apple, so therefore it is the symbol for an apple. Now, what about this apple? Okay, this is a little different. It does look kind of like an apple, but there's a more specific meaning that we know it means, right? So there is sort of a uniqueness there that you might still represent the real world apple with that symbol, but you'd be a little, it'd be a little bit silly. Typically, people mean the Apple and Mac hardware when they see that symbol. So, okay, what's the point of all the representation? Why should we be doing this? Well, I mean, we don't have a choice, is one answer, and also one nice thing for the long history of the theory is that it helps kind of jump over that mind-body divide, right? With some of the philosophies, the dualist philosophies, they say, how could we possibly bring information into the space of the mind? Well, this abstraction, right? But the more fundamental point is that we can't put the actual world into our heads. The world is vast. Doesn't always feel like it. It's vast. And beyond your front door, beyond the planet, beyond the solar system, it is a huge place. And it's complex. And it has existed for quite some time, and it extends deeply into space. There is a lot of world out there. And our minds are complex too, but they're limited. They're one little tiny sliver of the world's complexity. They only have so much intake. I can only take in so much of the world from my senses, and I can only, store so much information. We can store quite a lot of information, but we can only store so much given our neurons, right? Then we have to be able to keep memory traces somewhere, and there's only so many neurons to fill up with those kinds of things. And by fill up, of course, I mean adjust their weighting so that they fire in particular patterns that might represent something, right? So we need a way to operate on ideas that are meaningful in the outside world. That's kind of been the whole point of exploring what the heck is the mind even doing, right? Because we have all these cool capabilities of reasoning and generating new ideas and all that, but we need to be able to operate on things that are represented from the outside world. So let's look at a tree. In reality, a tree has near infinite complexity. It's made out of wood, for example. But how does wood work? What are wood cells like? What is its chemistry like? How does it eat? What are the atoms of wood? Does this wood grow every year? How does it grow? What are the differences? Right? It also has leaves, and that's a whole different thing. What's going on with chlorophyll? How the heck does chlorophyll convert sunlight into energy? What is it doing? How is that working? How does the food in this system work? What lives in this tree? How does its root system work? There's a lot of stuff going on in a tree. But we don't see all that directly, and we don't need to store all that to properly interact with the tree at the level that we live, right? I am not an arborist. I don't necessarily need to know how trees eat and how the ecosystem works around that tree. But I do want to have some representation of the tree. Now let's look at a tree. The word tree, the concept of tree. That's just a simple symbol. And it's used as a placeholder to point at all of those possible things we could know about trees. It's something that we're able to easily store in memory, and that summons up the idea of a tree so that we can consider them in mental operations. It doesn't represent the tree in full. It's a reduced form of a tree, limited by, my retina can only take in so much light. I can't even really see the shape of the bark on a tree from a certain distance. But I can see that it's brown, and that it must have bark, and that it must have wood. But that's about it. And that's all I need to store for a basic interaction with a tree. So it's a good starting point. It's a good starting point for how we can take a reduced form and make decisions about it. Like, I might like to climb that thing. Right? So, okay, now let's move back into the question of, do these representations need to be accurate to make use of them? How accurate, how high fidelity does a representation need to be for it to be useful and good to waste the energy storing, right? To start, let's talk about sea scallops. So, sea scallops are these weird little shelled mollusks. They have many, many eyes. You can see them just barely, the blue dots all over the inside of that shell. And they have very, very few neurons. Precious few neurons. And they live in this big, beautiful, complex environment. A coral type seabeds. They love those. They're colorful. They're complex. There's lots of predators floating around. The behavior of interest for this scallop is, as soon as a scallop detects light changes from the environment, it rapidly opens and closes its shell, and it is propelled away from where it currently is, hopefully to somewhere safe. So, what is this scallop representing? What does it require in terms of the fidelity of its representation of the outside world to be able to make sense of its actions, to be able to take the actions that it needs? Does it need to understand all of the colors and the details of its beautiful world? No, not even close. In fact, I would argue it probably can't. It doesn't have that capacity because it doesn't need that complexity. It doesn't need those kinds of neural patterns because it doesn't need that. It just can scoot away as soon as it detects something. It's almost robotic in the way that it handles living in the ocean. And that's fine. That's fine for a scallop. They just kind of sit there and filter things until they are eaten. And hopefully they get a chance to reproduce, right? So they don't mind. They don't need a complex internal representation of their world to be successful in it. So we wouldn't necessarily assume it has a strong representation. It may have some, but not much. A bee, on the other hand, what do bees need to know about their world? They don't just sit there and float around and, wait for things to disturb them. They take this proactive whole nest lifestyle altogether, the hive. So they got to keep track of a lot of stuff. Things like the location of flowers and their distance, the time of day, so that they can, know how to use the sun's. There's theories that they can use the sun, the bearing of the sun, to detect where they should be heading, and like how to fly. Certain things about the flight dynamics, the gusts of wind. How do I get there? What's the easiest route in terms of energetic consumption? That's a lot of stuff compared to the scallop. Scallop was a hyper simple neural entity, but bees, they got more going on, and they have more responsibilities. They have more things they need to be aware of in their environment. But that doesn't mean that bees are doing all the complex math of, physics for their flight dynamics and trigonometry for flower locations and all that stuff, right? Bees have some kind of representation. In fact, they have the ability to communicate things like distance, which is evidence that they have some kind of internal knowledge stored. I should really show it, but check it out sometime. Go look up bee waggle dances. They have this particular pattern. They can show other bees both direction and distance using some wiggles of their butts, their bee butts. So yeah, that's a good one. So we're painting the picture of this gradient, right? Representations only need to be as complex as they're required to guide our behavior in the world. Scallops have a very simple behavior. As soon as they see light, boom, they scoot. And that means that it's down to simple reflexes or maybe some conditioned responses in terms of the way the complexity of the representations they use. Bees, on the other hand, they definitely need more than that, but they don't need to go all the way to the level of detail of a physics equation. They focus on things that are more directly available for them to process. A physicist, a human physicist, on the other hand, they might need a more complex representation. So, they spend years developing an internal model that helps with that, right? Okay. So this also points us to some discussion of analog versus digital. So fully analog representations are just literal copies. As high fidelity as possible, they totally resemble the object. Whereas a fully digital representation would be completely arbitrary. Could be anything so long as it signifies, the object. So the ones and zeros of your computer, that's a pretty good representation. Those are everything your computer does is a digital representation. It's all ones and zeros flying through your processor 1 billion times a second, 3 billion times a second, multiple processors. So everything falls somewhere in between those two extremes. We have here, the person with the representation of the tree. That's sort of more in the digital realm. So, sorry, the image, the imagined tree is closer to an analog representation, in the mental imagery stuff we've talked about. Whereas the word tree is closer to a digital representation. Those things don't really have any bearing on the way the tree is shaped and the colors it has and all that, but it still points to tree in our minds. So let's look at how we handle some abstract things like temperature. Now, temperature is funny because it's this thing we absolutely directly perceive, but it's still kind of abstract. It's hard to describe it properly, right? It's just a feeling that we have. What kinds of things do we use to represent temperature? One simple one is symbols, little figures, little illustrations of water that we know to look like certain things. Look certain ways when there is heat and not heat. So ice cube is how water will look under very cold conditions, whereas the boiling off of water will occur at really hot conditions. I'd say that bears a lot of resemblance to things we observe in the real world, right? This is probably more analog. What about a meter? Meters are interesting. It's sort of a continuous representation of a numerical concept. So it's sort of blending the difference between, it's putting the numerical idea, the digital idea of what the temperature is, but putting it into a sort of spatially relevant representation. I'd say this is more digital than the drawings, but still fairly analog. And same thing happens if we, instead of using the meter, the physical, percentage of a bar, if you use color, you can represent temperature with color. I have a kettle in my office that heats up and changes color as it gets hot. Very much like this. Getting weirder, we can represent temperature with size. It works to the same degree that the meter works, although the meter sort of has more realistic fidelity with the world because we have physical objects in the world that show that kind of stuff, right? So we're playing with the edges of the numbers and more high fidelity sort of multimodal information. Then we have fully digital representations of temperature, like this scale and this scale. Now, they're both different. One is Fahrenheit, one is Celsius. We'll spoil it. The left one is Fahrenheit, the right one is Celsius. These are both fully digital representations. But it's interesting, they resonate a little differently, right? Celsius is the one that makes the scientific sense, right? -6 means 6 below freezing, and 101 means 1 above boiling for water. But there is something meaningful about the way that we handle temperature in Fahrenheit, and there's sort of the reason that it came to be initially is that Fahrenheit actually binds a little bit closer to just the lived experience of the temperature. So 0 is super cold and like getting to be dangerous, whereas 100 is super hot and getting to be dangerous for humans, right? 214 is far, far above dangerous, but even though it's boiling, that's what we don't want to get anywhere close to 214. So that's just a little bit of a little factoid about why we have Fahrenheit. And that actually points to why these two different representations, even though they're both fully digital, they map a little closer to different things. One is more useful for understanding the properties of water, whereas one is more useful for understanding the lived experience of a human being. So, how about time? We have a few different ways of looking at time. First is the round clock. Now, that's quite nice. It's a physical object in the real world. And we see how it moves with time. It moves, we have this sort of internal representation of the idea that these different hands point to hours, minutes, and seconds, But what about a digital clock? Well, obviously that will be a more digital representation of a numerical concept of the time. But those strokes on the, in the segments of those digital numbers, those don't really bear much resemblance to time. Neither does the first one, but at least the first one moves continuously, right? Here's a wild card. Sundials. How do sundials work? Well, they bind closely to the idea of where the position of the sun in the sky, which is classically a very good indicator of the time. So I wouldn't say that these are all very cleanly and clearly either analog or digital, but the idea of the analog clock is that it more closely resembles the passage of time than the digital clock, which is more convenient to store and read. So yeah, that's the idea of analog versus digital representation. Things that are more resemblant to the source are analog, and things that don't resemble the source at all are digital. And there's gradations. Things are typically somewhere in between because they combine these two. Because some elements of a representation might closely resemble the source, while others don't. Like for the temperatures, right? The meter, it sort of makes sense. We see how it climbs and falls with the heat. It's sort of a middle ground representation of a physical real-world object. But it's also just sort of an arbitrary line that moves up and down. It's not very representative of the temperature directly, at least in the way that we conceive of it. So, yeah, let's keep going into other ideas that are important for representation. Some representations are pretty non-obvious. So we've been talking a lot about things that are more directly relevant to the real world and the way that we perceive it and objects that exist in it. But some are more nuanced and implied. Relationships that you have to sort of reason over to create, as opposed to just experience directly. Bird dominance hierarchies are one of those. So let's talk about bird life. I am this little blue bird. I witness many things during my day. I see a red bird squabble with a green bird, and the red bird wins. They were fighting over food. It's always over food with these birds, right? I then see the green bird squabble with a yellow bird, or orange bird, I guess, and the green bird wins. Orange bird squabbles with a purple bird, orange bird wins. Purple bird squabbles with a yellow bird, purple bird wins. You might be starting to pick up a pattern. Who's on top and who's on bottom of this little hierarchy? Well, there are different ways, different levels to which I can internalize what's going on with these birds. The simplest way is illustrated by asking this question. Well, then I see the red bird and the yellow bird, they're going for the same food. Who's going to win? It's pretty obvious that the red bird's going to win. The red bird has a fight history of 100% success, and the yellow bird has a fight history of 100% failure. Yellow only lost, red only won. What about these two? The green bird and the purple bird. The green bird has lost a fight for food and won a fight for food, whereas the purple bird has lost a fight for food and won a fight for food. They both have a 50-50 shot according to their histories. But you and I both know that there is a bit of a hierarchy going on here because of the way that they've won different fights with different individuals. This is called transitive inference, and it comes to the idea that the red bird has beaten the green bird has beaten the orange has beaten purple, and purple has beaten yellow. That leads us to new knowledge. So it's not just the exact bird matchups that I've witnessed to determine who's probably the strongest bird, but also there's a transitive inference of, okay, the green bird beat the orange bird. The green bird's also going to probably beat whoever that orange bird beat. So the green bird will probably beat the purple bird. That's the prediction that I would make in this bird dominance hierarchy world where I'm witnessing a lot of birds fighting all day. It's fine. They just peck each other and try to get the worm. It's kind of that kind of stuff. Okay, so some birds in the world will keep track of dominance so they can engage with their environment more safely. You know, they'll know when to back off from a more more agile or dominant bird, and know when to call it quits and just go somewhere else so they don't get pecked and attacked and all that. So, but it's based on some pretty nuanced relationships under the hood. They have to work out information that's not directly stimulating their senses. And they are actually able to do this. So how? What do they need to be able to keep track of this kind of thing? At minimum, they need two things that are pretty apparent. They need to know who is who. They need to keep track of identity of individual birds. They need to know that red bird is really strong, and in real world, most of the times these birds all look quite similar. So they need to be able to have some way to map a bird's visage to the idea of identity. That's an important representation they need. They need separate identities for each bird that they keep track of in their local lives. They also need to know what their performance is. They need to keep some kind of representation of how well is that bird doing out here in the world. Oh, dang, red's beating up a lot of other birds. I need to know that. I need to know who the big jerk bird is. But knowing all of the representations so that you can make predictions about who should I risk squabbling with over food, well, that's more complex. So let's do some examples. If I'm bluebird and I encounter redbird, am I going to go for that apple? No, redbird's strong. I know that. What about yellowbird? Am I going to go for that apple? Yeah, screw that bird. I know that bird has lost quite a lot. Why? Why is that even possible? Why is that how my internal, I came to that conclusion genuinely. I thought about it. I thought about what we'd seen in the bird fights, and I was able to draw this prediction, right? Why? How is that working? What am I using? Because this is not stuff that's directly visible. I don't know. I've never seen yellowbird lose to me. I've never seen redbird defeat me. I've had to come up with this internal model of how these birds perform in the world. And that's the key. Internal models. Beyond just the cognitive maps, which are mostly, exact things that exist in the world, we also have more abstract models. So I predicted which bird I would win in a scuffle, right? I have, these are mental models that are representations that let us keep track of these abstract, complex relationships, specifically the causal structure. So remember contingency from the laws of association. I see tree in world leads to fire sometimes. It's a prerequisite at least. Fire leads to smoke. If I see smoke, I can recall, well, I can infer backwards, well, then there must be fire. But I can also infer even further back that, oh, this must be where trees are. There must be a fuel source for this fire. Fire comes from the wood. So I can also know that this is a wooded area. So when I do the same thing in my internal model, the goal is that I have some kind of structure that is identical in its contingency, in its causation, so that I can actually use these abstract symbols in the same way that the real world interacts. So I can know that trees lead to fire and fires lead to smoke, and I can also reason backward from smoke implies a fire, fire implies a tree. This is really useful, right? This is how we're able to keep track of abstract information that relates very directly to information in the world and relationships in the world. So we can track these causal relationships mentally, and we can simulate possible outcomes. So because our internal model states will map onto the way that the states change in the real world. So we can make predictions about what might happen using these internal models. And that's really useful. It's about reasoning over uncertainty and novel situations, because we're able to store information, relationships between symbols that have meaning in the world. So, for example, the apple is out of reach. I have been sad about it, and I know that. I have the concept for that. In my mind, I can make predictions about methods for interacting with that apple. For one thing, I know that shaking a tree causes it to fall. I could also work out that, well, it's cutting where it's attached to the tree might help. I could throw a spear at the tree and hope that the apple falls. One of those is certainly more likely to succeed than the other. But, well, actually it depends. It depends on how young that apple is. Shaking the tree probably won't make it fall. Whereas your aim has to be quite good for the other one. But these are both valid plans. They're ways to plan our interactions with the real world in our heads. Because we have these abstract representations, these symbols that we can move around in ways that resemble the real world. One last bit that this takes us to is there's the concept of both explicit and implicit representation, and this sort of caps off the discussion of more explicit representation deals with actual objects, things that are visible in the world, experiences, things that are extant in the actual world, real world things. So these kinds of representations are inherently meaningful representations because we can point them at the world and say, yes, that points to that, right? But there's also these implicit representations, the more abstract things, the more elaborate things, like keeping track of bird hierarchies and understanding how fire works and getting the idea to shake a tree for an apple to fall. And these implicit representations they involve additional processing. There's some kind of causation. There's relationships involved, and other ways, other more fine-tuned abstract ways. So explicit representations are the ones that point directly to the world, whereas implicit representations will typically involve those other representations, those explicit representations, to create a more nuanced model of the world. So, to recap the idea of representation in general, we're showing this sort of stepping forward from conditioning, and it continues inward. You can condition yourself to simple associations, but you can elaborate those further and further and further to these more complex internal models of the world, using abstract representations. So there's lots of kinds of representations. There's very simple ones, like, the simple contingency of, oh shoot, there's light, I move, versus more complex structures like, hey, what's the dominance hierarchy around here in Birdtown? There's also higher fidelity analog representations, more like mental imagery, versus more abstract digital representations, more like words and numerical representations that your computer uses. And then there's directly meaningful, explicit representations that point to things, sort of shared experiences, right? Things that we can point to and say, oh, your representation of that is similar to mine. Versus more complex, implicit representations that don't point directly to the world, but do highlight relationships in the world. All for the purpose of helping us to make predictions that guide our behavior. The more elaborate and, the more accurate and well tested your internal models are, the better your predictions will be about the world. This has a lot of importance right now. Models are huge. Models are the currency of science, and models are what are helping us make decisions on a global scale right now. But we have to refine them, and we have to make them better, and we have to update them with new information. So that's why it's always evolving. All right. Take care. I hope you're doing well.